You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. In each episode, we look at how people have experienced, described, or imagined armed conflict in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which representations of war and peace can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. In 2023, with generous funding from the Imperial War Museum's 1418 Now Legacy Fund, we're going to be hosting two art exhibitions designed to explore one of the many legacies of conflict, forced migration. Artist Diana Forster has created a moving art installation for us which traces the long journey taken by her mother as a child when she and her family were forcibly displaced from Poland during World War II to forced labour camps in Soviet Russia. Entitled Somewhere to Stay, its 10 panels depict the comfort and security of life before deportation and the various forms of accommodation which the forced migrants ended up trying to make home in, from wooden barracks in Siberian gulags to an ordinary house in Uzbekistan, to army tents stabled in a palace in Iran, thatched rondevals in Tanzania, and finally Nissan huts in resettlement camps in Scotland. The aim of this artwork is to communicate the unimaginably shocking rupture between a settled normal life and a terrifying future decided by people who did not care whether those they were transporting lived or died. Diana's family home was in fact in modern-day Ukraine, and the story she tells through her art obviously has distressing resonances with what many people are suffering today in many different parts of the world. Over the coming months, we want the story of this historic forced migration from 80 years ago to help us ask a question of great contemporary importance. How can we visualize the rupture, loss, and long-lasting struggles experienced by people who've been displaced from their homes through conflict? To help answer that question and to generate more conversation about how forced migration gets narrated and understood, we're releasing a series of podcasts featuring different voices on forced migration, including people with lived experience of displacement and a range of artists, authors, academics, and activists who've thought hard about how to visualize forced migration for others. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Elena Isayev, a historian and archaeologist based at the University of Exeter. Elena is a classicist by training, and her early research focused on social organisation and social mobility in southern Italy from the 4th to the 1st centuries BC. More recently, she has drawn on that deep history to apply a longue durée perspective to contemporary understandings of mobility, migration, displacement, and belonging. Lena has published a very wide range of books and articles, including a 2017 monograph called Migration, Mobility and Place in Ancient Italy, published by CUP, and an edited volume with Evan Jewell called Displacement and the Humanities. She has founded and contributes to a number of groundbreaking interdisciplinary projects which experiment with new conceptual frameworks for visualizing migration in order to influence policy making and practice in the 21st century. Lena is committed to interdisciplinary cross-sector dialogue and to amplifying the voices of people with lived experience of migration. Her research has already been groundbreaking in shifting habits of viewing, imagining, and representing refugees, asylum seekers, and mobility as an experience, and I'm really thrilled to have a chance to talk to her today. Lena, I'm so grateful to you for making time to talk to me. Thank you very much, and welcome to the Visualising War and Peace podcast.
Thank you very much, Alice, for that very generous introduction, and most importantly, for putting this project together and these really essential conversations, the rest of which I very much look forward to hearing afterwards.
Thank you. So as I just said, Lena, you're contributing to modern discourses on migration in lots of different ways. And we're definitely going to talk about your wide range of activities in that space in a moment. But can we begin first with where your own academic career started in the ancient world? So in your recent book, Migration, Mobility and Place in Ancient Italy, you write, a high level of human mobility was not exceptional among Mediterranean communities. Indeed, it was built into the way that society functioned. It was necessary for successful business ventures, military recruitment and deployment, establishment of a workforce and cultural vitality. It was anticipated in legal rights and restrictions and a prerequisite for the practice of war and the acquisition of wealth. So as you argue, mobility was in fact more the norm than the exception for many communities in ancient Italy. Did that extend to all levels of society, or was the mobility that you talk about experienced more by some than by others?
Thanks, Alice. Well, this is quite a big question. I should say that I came into the subject of migration, not because I wanted to work on migration, but because we were excavating sites and looking at ancient texts, and we think about site rise or decline. And when you get beyond the abstract notion of rise and decline, what you're actually looking at is people coming together and moving apart. So I was trying to understand what that meant in the ancient world. First of all, what causes drove people to come together and move apart, but also then, of course, traveling across a distance. And in this day and age, we think of migration as something crosses a border, but in the ancient world, you don't really have national borders like that. One of the things that me and other colleagues, I guess, are trying to find out, people like Evan Jewell, who you've mentioned, or Ben Gray, Nicholas Purcell, and Peregrine Horton, and many others now, is that migration as object of study, as something you can build a policy around or something you can quantify, is almost impossible to find in the ancient world in the same way. What we're studying may not have been of interest in the same way in the ancient world. You might think about it in terms of a life cycle. There are periods in people's lives when the freedom is about the ability to move and the ability to go places and the ability to move in the way you might want. And there are other times in one's life where the freedom is about being able to stay and not have to move. I guess that doesn't directly answer, I think, your question, but maybe it gets us a little bit towards thinking about the problematics of our own categories today. And I guess the one other thing you asked me about that I haven't touched on is who moves. So I've talked about kinds of people. Often people think in terms of the rich and the not so rich, or the elite who have the potential to move easier. But in fact, we have to think of different kinds of movements. So it's not like today where you go and you are able to pay for a flight and therefore you're able to go. You're not able to pay for a flight and therefore not able to go. It's more that where you're moving to might provide you with a job, might provide you with other opportunities. And one of the ways you might move is through helping out, maybe on a boat, maybe along a trackway. So when we think about funds to move, I think it's more about the comfort of that mobility rather than the actual ability to move in that way.
So already you're really exploding some modern assumptions about migration by showing us how differently migration was conceived, experienced in antiquity, no national borders, as you say, but different kinds of things controlling when and why different kinds of people might move, how they might move, as you say, the comfort or not of that. You mentioned obviously slavery, you've mentioned trade, very, very different forces that result in movement of different peoples to and from different places. And it would just be interesting to hear a little bit more about the impact. So as you say in your book, this mobility is common. There are multiple forms of it, fair amount of migration in all sorts of different directions in antiquity around the ancient Mediterranean. What kinds of impacts did that volume of mobility have on different kinds of communities? As you say, your work started in looking at the rise and fall of cities, of towns, places that people moved away from as well as moved to. Can you just talk us through a little bit about the impact across the ancient Mediterranean of the volume of mobility that you and your colleagues have identified?
One of the ways to think about mobility in the ancient world, it wasn't necessarily coming from A to B. It's not that people set out in a direction and knew exactly where they were going, and they were never necessarily going to move there for the purposes of residence, let's say, or changing status. Some of it may have been like that, but a lot of it may have been for other reasons. It might be called what's called cyclical. And cyclical could mean that you could go for a month, you can go for 3 months, you might go for several years and eventually return to where you came from or not. So that makes it very difficult to think about impact. What we find in the ancient world, trying to identify instances where people don't move very much is possibly more difficult than identifying, instances where people do move. Do we get large influxes of people in the ancient world? That's the other thing you might want to ask. And do people talk about them? Late antiquity is a period that's thought to be the age of migration, and the collapse of empire is also posited in that period. And traditionally, that's been put down to the moving hordes and barbarians. So these are moving into the so-called civilized empire. But as more recent studies are showing, that's a very problematic picture. One, because it assumes that mobility wasn't really there to begin with, and this is a new kind of in-migration. Two, because it assumes that the people who were continuing to be mobile were somehow different or unknown to other people who seem to be a settled core. What you're actually getting is oftentimes warring factions within the empire. And some of our biggest so-called barbarians were themselves part of the Roman army who became leaders. And all of their violent acts could be considered done within the empire. So they've never necessarily left the empire. I mean, you might think of people like Attila the Hun or Alaric or these kind of people who are very well known. Yes, there was a lot of impact in terms of the infrastructure breaking down. And yes, there may have been less stability in terms of where people lived and people feeling threatened and therefore maybe being forced to move away from certain areas where there might be more opportunities for wars to happen or for conflict to happen. But that is not necessarily the result of migration. And again, in late antiquity, there's a sense that maybe climate change affected certain kind of harvests that had an effect on economy, but also that the empire was well overstretched and there were too many competing factions for its stability. So when we talk about impact, even in something like that, like the age of migration, it becomes a problem to think about it in those terms as migration being the cause. And Michael Meyer has written a bit about this along with other people to try to kind of shift a bit our understanding of these kind of moments.
So, Elena, lots of things coming out there. I'm really struck by you underlining the point that for large parts of antiquity, migration didn't necessarily involve a change in status, a change in identity. Some migrations maybe lasted 6 months, some several years, but not with that strong sense of becoming a migrant or becoming a refugee necessarily. Of course, that must have happened for some, and that certainly happened when there was a change of identity from freedom to enslaved, for example. But I think it's worth hanging on to that point that not all migrations resulted in or were thought of as a change in status. And you've also made that very important point that we should be understanding migration not as a cause necessarily, but as a symptom of wider geopolitical, socio-political factors. Interesting that you also brought up climate change. Increasingly, recent research has been showing that that's very much a factor in antiquity too. But I think one of the things that particularly struck me as well in your answer there was the language that you started alluding to, this idea that late antiquity in particular might be seen as the age of migration when people started talking about moving hordes and barbarians. And that gets me thinking about terminology and language, the discourse of migration in antiquity. Obviously, today, migration is a very loaded word. It's been heavily politicized by various interest groups. In some contexts, of course, we celebrate global interconnectedness and our ability to travel, our freedom of movement, and so on. But as we all know, there are also very toxic discourses around migration, which police who should be allowed to migrate and in what circumstances, and which deem certain kinds of migrants and certain kinds of mobility a threat. So I'd be interested to know a bit about how people in ancient Italy talked about mobility. And do we have enough evidence really to be able to reconstruct ancient discourses of migration?
That last question you asked is particularly interesting, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But just very quickly on terminology, I will focus on the Latin terminology because our own kind of term migration comes from migrare, which is a Latin term. And what we find is actually that there is no term in our earliest Latin for migrant. There's no term that's equivalent to the term migrant, where somehow all the people who are on the move can be put into one category and be seen as separate or exceptional to the norm simply based on the fact that they move. From what I understand of reading some of the ancient literature, that would be a very bizarre thing to think because it was such an everyday, not just everyday part of life, but that's how you dealt with problems, that's how you communicated, that's how you moved around in society and the world. In terms of the terminologies that we do have, what we do have is people who might be coming in from the outside. And what interests, it seems, the ancient discourse is what the relationship of that individual is to the place where they're coming to and those who live there. So you might have a hostis, a hostile incomer, a hospice, one that is a friendly incomer. You might have a term for peregrinus, and that identifies somebody as who moves around. You have a term called incoli, which eventually means a resident alien, but the initial use of that is just simply inhabitant. And then you have all sorts of different kinds of terms for people who inhabit a place, like cives, which are citizens, but there could be other inhabitants where it's not clear what their status is. The multiplicity of this is both something that the ancient playwright like Plautus plays with, but also implies that some of those categories might be interchangeable and an individual status may change depending on where they're traveling to and who they know. So the most scary person, if you'd like, I mean, a civilian, as distinct from a conqueror, I haven't mentioned those, of course, they're a very different category, is somebody who's unknown. It's both scary for the individual to be unknown, not within networks of protection, but also the person who is unknown is the one you would fear. And in Plautus, one of the characters says you would fear them like you would fear the wolf. So how do you become known? And the way you become known is by connecting with others. And I think maybe hopefully we'll have ability to discuss that a little bit later in a different context. What you do get, again, in late antiquity, you get words that mean vagrant or vagrancy. And that associates a negative connotation to somebody's propensity to be mobile. And in the late antiquity, what we do know is that people really had to have a reason for being where they were. So it's not so much about letting the outsider in or not, but rather that you had a reason, whether by job or being as part of somebody's farmstead, to be on that farmstead, or to be part of a religious order, or to be mobile because you were part of that religious order. So again, yes, there are more controls and negativities around people who are moving, but rather it's about those who seem not necessarily known for the reasons there. So it's who are not under frameworks of control, usually by the state or by other kinds of agents.
It's really interesting pulling that out of the ancient language and ancient patterns of talking about different kinds of mobility and migration. I've talked to other experts on migration who also boil it down to who controls knowledge production around migration. That's one of the biggest factors that then controls attitudes and ultimately policy and so on. And you're putting your finger on that there. And it's about placing people, understanding their relationship to a place, understanding who they are as an outsider who might be coming in. And I think it's really important that we do recognize that in antiquity, that mobility wasn't something that people were worried about, but perhaps the unknown quantity that strangeness might bring. So that's really interesting. That brings me actually on to a question about evolving sense of place and space. As you say, I think we'll come back in a minute to how people welcomed strangers and the politics of hospitality. But first of all, I know that some of your early work and your continuing work looks very closely at the evolving sense of space and place in antiquity and the ways in which political events such as Rome's social war or imperial expansion changed how people imagined and understood social, cultural, and political space and their place in it. It would be interesting just to hear a little bit about that, these sort of shifting notions of space and place and how they impacted on ideas of mobility and migration and vice versa.
The sense of place is, I guess, actually where I started off with mobility rather than mobility. So trying to understand what a relational understanding of place means. So trying to think into a time before nation states, which actually is quite difficult to do because it's not so much that you can just say, oh, well, there were no national borders, but how to reimagine it, what that actually means on the ground. So one way we might think about it is it was also a world with no regional maps to scale, which means that land was not necessarily seen as territory beyond either private ownership or ownership, say, in a sacred context. It's not that land wasn't meaningful, but its value was differently conceived. So when one's attachment is to the land, it means possibly something different in the ancient world. One of the things, of course, that didn't happen is citizenship belonging did not overlap with territory. But that doesn't mean that places didn't have emotional draws on people. Cicero, who's an ancient historian and politician and jurist, he is somebody who talks a lot about place and home and Rome. When he's exiled from Rome, we have a lot of painful writings from him about that. And there we might ask, well, what is it that he misses? It's not so much being a citizen of Rome, but the way he talks about Rome. It's very much a place of interaction for him. It's a place where a certain kind of living takes place, which is also different from where he was born. Where he was born was not Rome. He was born in Arpinum, which is outside of Rome. And he talks about that place in a very different way as home. So that is his birth home, and Rome as a city becomes almost both as what he calls an adoptive fatherland, but that's very different than what he actually does there and what that means to him. So belonging is something quite more abstract. Another good example of that is Livy's Camilla's speech. So this is when people are supposedly exiled from Rome during the Gallic sack. And when the Gauls finally leave, a lot of these, or maybe we might call refugees, come back to the city, supposedly find it destroyed. And then there's a discussion of, do we stay in this city, which is destroyed, or do we move to another city called Veii? And Livy, writing about this about 300 years later, has to make a case why the very land of Rome, the site of Rome, is important for being Roman. And he really struggles precisely because there is no nation state. So in the end, he draws on elements of sacredness, some elements, this is everybody's home. And in this, he incorporates all Romans, some of whom may have never been to the city. So even when there's opportunities to think about borders, like the sacred border that is around Rome, he doesn't. Or rather, he might mention it, but on the other hand, he is not interested in seeing it as, if you like, a cordon. So it might be a line that it doesn't cross, or there are certain activities that have to take place within it, the pomerium, certain kind of rights that need to be held, but it's not something that's territorially defined. So in terms of place and space, that's the kind of way that we understand how it means something very different in the ancient world. And sometimes what I get asked is, yeah, but there were walls. My answer tends to be to that is, well, yeah, but those walls didn't encompass everything a place was anyway. So it doesn't act in the same way as a national border.
Thank you. I think that example there just reminds us that often we interpret the archaeological and the textual evidence from the ancient world according to anachronistic models, labels. They might be anachronistic within antiquity, so later ancient notions of colonization that we superimpose and that they superimposed on earlier settlements, but also very much modern notions of colonization, of mobility, of citizenship, of territory, and so on. And I'm really struck by the way you've unpacked ancient ideas of place and space as having a fairly loose connection with the land itself and a connection much more with intangible phenomena like sense of community, sense of belonging, cultural memory, identity, and sacredness and sacred identity and heritage, and so on. You've brought us on very beautifully to forced migration specifically, which is what our project is particularly interested in. Obviously, there are all sorts of reasons, all sorts of triggers, all sorts of factors that govern and precipitate different kinds of mobility in the ancient world. But as you say, there are a number of different ways in which forced migration happened, through war, through slavery. Earlier, you mentioned climate change and resources, just now mentioned deliberate political policy that is allocating members of a community to one place or to another. So it would just be interesting to know whether we have any evidence that forced migrants were viewed differently in antiquity from people whose mobility was more a matter of choice or indeed a matter of privilege.
And the question is, when would they have been viewed differently? So first of all, just in terms of visibility, it's very difficult, of course, to capture people on the move. And that's why previously I referred to a lot of bioarchaeological evidence. Sometimes we see other cultural kind of contacts, but it's often difficult to translate that into, is it people moving? Is it objects moving? Is it knowledge moving? Or is it exchange that, as we started off by saying, is more cyclical? We also have to think about producers moving. So it's even more difficult from the evidence we have to be able to tell, at least materially, what reasons people would have been moving for, even if we find them. Like, would they have been forced into mobility? Sometimes we can tell people are undernourished and so on, or are buried with very few objects. So we might be able to say, well, maybe these people are either been enslaved or are living in conditions that are very hurriedly put together, and that might suggest some kind of displacement or forced movement. But outside of the material evidence, in terms of attitudes to people who are displaced, I think one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, who is telling us these stories? So why are we even told stories of displacement? What kind of displacement is it in the ancient world? When we think about displacement, so we hear kind of almost by the way in a lot of historical narratives that people must be moved and are moving. Even if we think of a quite well-known episode, which is Pompeii. So people were forced to leave the city very quickly and disperse very quickly, and there would have been tens of thousands of them. It was a big city. We know almost nothing to where they ended up. We hear nothing in our ancient sources as if this was a huge, catastrophe that in terms of people and where they would be placed. Now, you can't use that as a representation of how migrants were thought about, or people who were coming in who were forcibly displaced were thought about. But that's just to give you a sense of almost the disinterest about that aspect of that very well-known forced mobility. The ones we do hear about, so in the ancient Greek texts, we hear the suppliant women is perhaps one of the most direct focus points about people who are in displacement and what happens to them. There we have a group of women, 50 Danaids, who are the daughters of Danaus, and they are escaping a forced marriage and end up in Argos. And they plead with the king to allow them to come in to their city. So the king then has to consult the people, because technically he's in a democratic context. So the whole play, which is performed for the first time just when the democratic experiment, if you'd like, in Athens appears, and the real discourses that the play, I guess, would be interesting for the audience, is who makes the decisions, who has the responsibility at a time of democracy as distinct from, for example, oligarchy. And these women, and this example of a problem for authorities, just happens to be that of these displaced group. That doesn't mean that the play isn't interested in their plight. Of course it is. And that brings out other very interesting elements. But just the reason for that is it wasn't because there was huge amounts of displacement, so therefore we have a play about displacement. The other thing is these people are all women. So they are the most vulnerable. And oftentimes when we get people who are displaced en masse presented in literature, they are often women, children, or the elderly. And actually, we very rarely get presentations of displaced people en masse. Usually we hear about individual exiles, and maybe we get a chance to talk about them a little bit later on. So that's the first thing to say, that although we hear that there must have been tens of thousands of people wandering due to sieges and so on, they don't seem to be the focus of a lot of ancient literature, which is what we'd imagine them being presented. And how these people are treated. Well, the people themselves, the ancient context, interestingly, is aware that to be given welcome, to be given protection, you have to present yourself as weak. That doesn't mean that the person is weak. So there is a recognition in this particular play about the suppliants. There's a moment where the father counsels his daughters to remember that they cannot speak with a strong voice, despite the fact that what they've been doing throughout the play so far is telling the king what they have to do and telling him how to address his people. So the father says, look, you are not in a position to do this, which has that dichotomy of here is somebody having to present themselves as a victim, and yet behind this victimhood is clearly somebody with a strong voice and who has done this. They have actually escaped. They have taken that very difficult decision and have had the strength to do it. So there's a lot of agency that is accepted in the ancient context in a way that we find very difficult today. In terms of whether these people get accepted or not, is only partially to do with their coming from the outside. So there has to be something that proves that they are not going to be a threat to the community into which they're coming on the one hand, because they are presented as outsiders, as foreign, despite the fact that they are arguing for the fact that in their ancestors originated from the same place, so that they are kin, at least in mythical terms. But the really much bigger question in ancient communities is to whether taking these people in will bring war onto them by the people who are actually chasing them. So the people who they are escaping from. If we convert that into contemporary contexts, the people who are leaving Ukraine today, whether Britain takes them or not, would be as if Britain was thinking, us taking in these people, would it bring war on Britain by Russia, who is forcing people to leave, I guess, if they are seen as perpetrators rather than Ukraine, if they were to take them and give them asylum or give them protection, which is very strange because that is only discussed in very, very few instances with, for example, some very key exiles leading, for example, Hong Kong and China, who are known by name to the Chinese authorities. And China will come in at times and say, you shouldn't give this person asylum. You have to extradite them back to China to face criminal charges or something else. But never when it comes to en masse. And even at that point, we don't get any threats of war directly on these people. So the situations are very different. And just because somebody is displaced or is seeking asylum, the reasons for it are very different than they are framed in the current day and age. And the threats that are felt to society are not simply due to the fact that we don't want too many people because we're overcrowded. We don't really get that in the ancient world. Overpopulation, scholars have argued, is often a political stance rather than a reality in the ancient world anyways.
Thank you. So as you say, very different calculations being made by individuals, by states about the threat or benefits of incoming groups, but you're also underlining also a relative disinterest at times in migrations. It is astonishing, as you say, in many ways, that we don't know about the people who were displaced from Pompeii. We don't know where they ended up. We don't, there isn't any storytelling about their lives. There isn't any storytelling in art or in literature at all. I want to come back to the questions you've raised around Aeschylus's play, The Suppliant Women, and the dichotomy between weakness and agency in the identity of an asylum seeker or a refugee in a minute. But first, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about hospitality and welcome. So as you've been saying, travel and mobility were very much the norm in antiquity, not just in ancient Italy, but across the whole of the ancient Mediterranean. And that truth goes back a very long way in time. And one of the earliest texts to survive from ancient Greece is Homer's Odyssey, which narrates the hero Odysseus' 10-year-long journey home from the Trojan War, which of course was the subject of Homer's Iliad. And in some ways, Odysseus' wandering is partly a forced migration. It is a displacement following conflict. He's been to war. He's trying to find his way home. You mentioned the importance of home in that poem earlier. But his long journey home is also partly voluntary. It is homeward bound. It's not a journey of displacement as such. And it is a very privileged form of adventuring that's celebrated in the poem as a voyage of discovery, among other things. And that's obviously a far cry from the forced migrations of most people who are displaced by war. But one of the recurring themes in this poem and in other Greek storytelling is the theme of xenia, the concept of guest friendship or hospitality. And I wonder if you can define xenia for us and tell us a bit about its importance in Greek culture and how it maybe intersects with attitudes to mobility and migration, and indeed migrants in antiquity.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. And I like the fact that you're questioning the forcedness of Odysseus's journeying. I think I'm not sure that this is how it would have been framed in the ancient world. I mean, you might frame it as a drive, or you might frame it as a moira, which is kind of his destiny to do certain kinds of things. And it's interesting the role that higher powers like the gods play in those contexts, especially when you don't have anything resembling a state. So what you have are groups of interdependent kind of communities or kinship groups, and the polis might be a wider extension of that. I'm not somebody who's an expert on that side of it. Ben Gray has written wonderful things around thinking through places like the polis and migration, exiles, and so on. Coming back to xenia and friendship, the reason I start with this is because it really is about networks of interdependence. It is precisely that. How do you survive in a world which can be hostile, where sometimes resources can be lacking, where you're trying to find ways of increasing your networks and, more importantly, networks interconnecting with other networks? So reciprocity is very important in this kind of context. And Derrida has written about xenia, hospitality, and does bring up the notions of reciprocity within that. I won't talk very much about Derrida because he's interpreting ancient contexts in certain ways and provides wonderful new opportunities to think about it, but also takes us, I think, a little bit off course here. I think xenia as guest friendship is very much about that. It's how do you become known? How do you have people who vouch for you? How do you get people to protect you and support you when you need that? And I guess that is the wider context of hospitality and why hospitality is just so important, particularly, well, in the ancient context, but also even today. We could extend notions of hospitality to, for example, the law of the sea. The law of the sea is what drives sailors to help other sailors, no matter who they are or where they're from, because what will happen is in another time that they might be in need of help, somebody will help them at sea as well. And that can also extend to deserts and other kinds of environment. That kind of hosting, where we're not talking about hosting forever necessarily. And the xenia that we find in contexts like Odysseus, it isn't forever. It's for a certain amount of time to allow the person to move on their way to where they wanted to be. Some of them did stay, but Aeneas is somebody who stayed in Italy, but he comes as a refugee and appeals to some of the local kings, Latinus, to be able to stay on the land. But actually what they do is they offer their support. So they offer the reciprocity. So if I'm able to stay, if I can, work with you, I will help you conquer your enemies and so on. So again, there's a kind of interdependence. And the kind of xenia that's often in these texts is very much that around the elites. It's about elite contracts. It's also about how you work in a world where we don't have any documents. How do you prove that somebody really is who they are? And one object that worked with before, and also bringing in musicians like Marion Wood or abstract artists like Katrin Webster that we worked in Swansea on. It was called Future Memory in Place. And it was all about thinking through how people from different worlds connect through the objects of the Tessar Hospitalis, which is a little bit like a friendship bracelet. It has two halves. These two halves only fit together because they're specifically made, and each person carries that half. And when they might meet again, each of them has the half. And technically, if they've been gone for generations and no longer recognize each other, they can recognize each other through that object. In the ancient world, we have these little objects. One of the most well-known ones is a little tiny half of an ivory lion, which is in Rome in the museum. But we also have one that is found in North Africa in ancient Carthage, what would have been ancient Carthage, dating from the 6th century BC. And it has written in an Etruscan text, so that's an old Italic language in the kind of middle and north of Italy, that I am Puino from Carthage, which suggests that there would have been somebody living in ancient Carthage, North Africa, who had a guest friend in Italy. And how does this object work? We know from, interestingly, again, the comedy of Plautus, among others, where there is a character happens to be from North Carthage, who has a guest friend in northern Greece. And he arrives there not knowing that his guest friend is dead, but finds the house of his guest friend where the son opens the door. And when he shows him his half of the tessera, the son goes looking for the other half. So we could see that this kind of friendship, or whether they had, if you'd like, the kind of house to do so. Despite that, even in the Odyssey, Odysseus, his old shepherd, gives him hospitality. And one of the things that Shepherd talks about is that he's not really that interested in who this person is because he's been lied to before. So which implies that even somebody like a shepherd who has very little to offer, whether he's an ideological construct within the myth is another question. But the point is, it implies that even he gets lots of people passing to whom he gives hospitality and then sends them on their way. And some of them lie to him and take advantage of his hosting.
And particularly explain how ancient ideas of xenia can get us thinking productively about how we view asylum seekers and refugees today.
And what a request for protection or hospitality does is it addressed to somebody. So in a way, it addresses someone as a sovereign to be able to make that decision for protection or not. So in the ancient context, the ability to give protection was one way of displaying sovereignty, which is almost the opposite of today. So the way a lot of nations display sovereignty today is the ability to say, we are not taking anybody in. And that, I mean, I'm describing it in a very maybe simplistic way. It's not quite that simple, but it does involve these kind of ways. Is nobody can tell us that we have to take in refugees, rather than we have the capacity and we can act as sovereign without being threatened by anybody told what to do, to be able to give hospitality to whom we want. So the example I used earlier by an exile who might be coming from Hong Kong in relationship to China, a sovereign act is to say, no, we don't have to give this person back. We can rightly give them protection if we want, because we are a sovereign state, and you have no right to tell us who we can protect or not. So, I mean, that might be a very strange way of thinking about agency, but actually, that is something that is the power of somebody coming in from the outside. And some scholars talk about how the relations around people seeking asylum was actually some of the first elements around international relations. So asylum seekers are not just involved in international relations or some kind of side exceptional element to it, but very much at the core of a lot of systems that function within international relations. The other way I guess we could think about it, and that's not so much as I say in that article directly, because we've discussed a lot of the things already in that article, but maybe thinking about how people who are displaced, who are often seen as outsiders in some kind of liminal space or limbo, we need to really start thinking about them as not outside, but indicating the systemic edge, which is something that Sasson talks about. So in other words, they are very much part of the inside and are the making of it, whether they are internally displaced or not internally displaced. If we think of these people as something that's part of our wider society, then we think about them rather differently, rather than something that's exceptional to it. And Giorgio Agamben wrote about exception, the state of exception. And that has been challenged a lot, especially by people who are in contexts of displacement. So in a way, this is kind of moving on from the kind of things discussed in that Red Cross article, and is what's happened in a lot of discourse in the last few years since I've had a chance to think about those issues. So it's also how you bring in understandings of people who are in displacement, not just by those of us who are not currently in context of displacement, but really listening very carefully to not being called victim. And I would add to that actually the problematics of resilience. So resilience is something that's become used everywhere. But if you talk to people who are in really distressing situations, in conflicts and post-conflicts and in crises, they challenge the term resilience, because they could say, by being resilient, we're being asked to just continually cope with this when we're not coping. And we hate being called strong just because we survive. What kind of survival is it? So I think these kind of issues are what came out of the foundation of between hospitality and asylum when thinking about agency, but also how certain terminologies are placed on people in those kind of contexts.
Yeah, as you say, that label resilient and the concept of resilience is double-edged, isn't it? And again, it gets to the heart of that paradox between power and powerlessness, which is at the, that tension at the heart of the experience of anyone whose life is suddenly out of their own control. the controls that they can exert are quite limited. It might take the form of an appeal. It might take the form of a request for help, an urgent and agential request for help, but that's the limit of their power. So it's really good to come to that. I'm really struck by what you've just said as well about asylum seekers, the refugee status, and so on, being actually foundational to some elements of international relations. And again, in your answer there, you reminded me that borders don't exist in the way that they do today in antiquity. And so antiquity offers us, among many other sources of inspiration, antiquity offers us an opportunity to think about inside and outside differently. You're absolutely right. We've got climate change marching urgently on, climate-related conflict as well. The number of likely asylum seekers and refugees in the next 30 years is growing exponentially. And yet we still persist in seeing this in terms of national policy, not a global challenge. We put our borders down very, very firmly. We mark what's inside and what's outside, rather than seeing people who've been displaced by climate change or by conflict or whatever it might be as part of a wider society, as part of our wider society. And I think in that Red Cross article, actually, you've talked about the example of the Athenians and the Plataeans who supplicate the Athenians for asylum. And you've talked about this as, I think you say throughout history, responses to requests for asylum and hospitality have been central to discourses on morality and in formulating the character of a society, allowing for the isolation of the barbaric from the rest. A state's reputation can be created or destroyed depending on its response to appeals for asylum. So, I really like the way you've been turning around this idea of sovereignty on its head and thinking very much about sovereignty as a choice to take people in and to offer asylum, and not about drawing up the drawbridge and firmly defending one's walls. You've touched on outside, inside, and liminal spaces and so on. And again, in your Red Cross article, you explore parallels between ancient asylum seekers who wait in the liminal spaces of Greek sanctuaries, who had to be very resourceful in finding ways to appeal to potential hosts, and then long-term inhabitants of refugee camps, and who also have to employ innovative, influential, exceptional politics, as you put it, to gain some form of control over their own lives. And I know that you've spent quite a bit of time in a particular refugee camp in Palestine through a project called Campus in Camps. Can you tell us a bit about that project and your involvement in it?
So in the ancient world, what we get is much fewer places where you were excluded from. And often that was your homeland or somewhere either because of destruction or because of exile, than the points where you could be included from. So in other words, the idea of non-arrival, which is what we find mostly today, it was basically not what most of our ancient writings of people in displacement are about, or in exile. Most of those writings are about not the inability to return to somewhere. So when I was writing about this initially, I thought I was posing the idea that the problem, in the ancient world was non-return, not non-arrival, while today it's mostly non-arrival. And somebody who was in a refugee camp corrected me. They said, no, it's not that non-return is not an issue. It's just that on top of the inability to return, you also have this inability to be able to arrive somewhere. So that's just another kind of difference and a different way of thinking about that. In terms of my own works with people who are in camps or outside of camps, just to clarify that I didn't spend very long in Campus and Camps. What I did have done for a long time, well over a decade now, is to really think together with people who are in context of displacement. And they were working both on a very international platform, some of which included Dheisheh refugee camp in Palestine in the West Bank. And they eventually came to set up a Campus and Camps. And it was as part of Campus and Camps that they said, did you want to come and think with us? And this was in around 2015. So quite a long time afterwards, and a very difficult time. There's a lot of aggression and violence towards people in the West Bank, as well as within the West Bank. And so one of the things that Campus and Camps was doing is it wasn't an external program brought into the camp, but rather something that with colleagues in the camp, they created as a lens through which to think about their own situation or condition. And what that's about, it's about taking a concept that exists anywhere in the world, like democracy, like citizenship, or like the suburb, and thinking, how does that nature of that concept change how we understand it if we look at it from the perspective of the camp? So in a way, this rang very much with me because, of course, we as historians, what we do is say, how is that concept understood differently if we take it from the perspective of a different context in history? So not geopolitically, but in history. I could very much understand where they were coming from and really wanted to learn much more about what that means about these big concepts. And so one of the things we did is think about the notion of land together, the sacredness of land and the meaning of land and territory at a time when that was not allowed, and where the place where the site where one lived was not allowed to be called a place, because you weren't allowed to attach memories to it if you'd like, because it's seen as in being in displacement rather than a home, which is unreachable. So what do you do with a life that sometimes lived over generations in these sites? How do you allow it to be meaningful? How do you not simply see it as a time in limbo or a time of passing, but actually meaningful? And I guess that comes back to thinking about it not as outside of society, but a kind of the systemic edge. So in other words, the place where extremes of where we live that allows people to live in certain kind of conditions with so little freedom in some cases, an inability to move, or the forced continuous movement is how we might want to see these kinds of places. So that time together, one of the things we did is something called a detour. So people in the Haitian were often asked to give tours of the refugee camp, and they've taken and called it the detour. And we walked together through the site and thought about it both in architectural terms, in terms of ideas of the public gathering, what does home mean in a place like that, and what is the actual soil connected to it. So that's kind of where it all started. I mean, it led to many other things. I was very grateful for my colleagues there allowing me to come and learn with them in what really seemed like a time beyond a possibility of learning.
Yeah, so an extraordinary learning environment, the camp as a place for relearning, rethinking, partly for people there in place, making meaning out of life, not meaning that's framed by the posed assumptions and concepts that adhere to more stable forms of city, state, town. So learning on that front, relearning, learning to make meaning, but also that kind of learning where you're really unpicking concepts that mean one thing in a stable environment, but another thing in limbo, that learning that can then teach, that can deconstruct ideas of home, deconstruct all sorts of different ideas. I think you've involved some of your students at Exeter in this project through a course that you teach on ancient journeys and migrations. So they've contributed to what's called the Collective Dictionary, which is a collaboration between your students and the Campus in Camps project. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Having been to the Haitian refugee camp and just found that such an incredible way of rethinking the world together. So I invited some of the colleagues from there to see if they wanted to engage with some of our students and basically really teach them those kind of methods of learning. And the students as well to bring with them with their knowledge about the ancient world. And again, that kind of thinking before and beyond the nation state. So it's about alternative imaginaries. And I often ask some of the colleagues I work with in these different contexts, it's like, I get a lot out of being with you and thinking together, but what is it that I can bring? And they said, well, you bring the alternative imaginaries we can think into in a safe space to reflect on the contemporary concerns, but also about positioning the contemporary world in a much longer historical durée or span, which gives a sense of, well, I don't want to use the word hope because I'm not sure that's the right context or word that the people in context that are in displacement would use, but rather that it's not about history repeating itself at all, but rather that there are waves or dips and crests that people go through. And if we think that there are always people who are either included or excluded, it's just different forms of exclusion and inclusion, which at the moment seems to be around the notion of being from the outside and migrant. But coming back to the class, so we were looking at ancient journeys and migrants is what the course was called. And I invited colleagues to come and together to think about what could we contribute as a volume to the collective dictionary series. And the word that we came up with, the concept, is that of xenia, actually, of hospitality. But we didn't just want to do it in a theoretical way or simply look at ancient texts, but rather really engage with communities in our local environment around Exeter, so in Devon. And we got in touch with Devon Refugee Support, who are this incredible welcoming organization where many volunteers are not just from Devon or students, but are also people who themselves have come as refugees and asylum seekers. So it's this really incredible group. And together we went on walks. walks. Walks is something that we use as almost a radical pedagogy. And to think together, which gets rid of hierarchies. It gets rid of insider or outsider. It doesn't assume that anyone necessarily knows more about the place they're at just because they happen to be living there. I mean, because the one thing we have to remember is often students are incomers themselves. So it's about discovering a place together on the one hand. So we worked on that and we created this volume, which had a combination of poetry, of having gatherings. So one of my colleagues, Christopher Gill, who's now a retired philosopher, very kindly let us use his home to hold dinners where people would bring food from all over, and they would come, both students and people in the neighborhood, some of whom who came as refugees or asylum seekers would come and join in for these kind of discussions, which kind of tried to create that atmosphere of Xenia in real terms as a practice place. So, and think about place as relational rather than something defined by sight as well.
You mentioned the phrase radical pedagogies, and that really cuts through a lot of your work. You know, your work's characterized not just by expert illuminating readings of ancient texts and ancient sites, but also by innovative approaches to new knowledge production and theory. So I'm thinking also of your involvement in the Al-Maisha project, which fosters collective learning about displacement, diaspora, and citizenship, precisely by encouraging participants to practice neighbouring and to practice hospitality as radical political acts. So can you tell us a bit more about these radical pedagogies and this project in particular?
So when I was in Dehesha, one of the people I met, along with Alessandro Petty and Sandy Hilal, were colleagues Diego Segato, another architect who happens to be from Italy, but who was living and working in Dehesha at the time, and Ishaq Al-Barbary, who was actually directing and leading the Campus and Camps program. He has since moved on to do other things, but he's originally from Dehesha. And we got invited by Office of Displaced Designers to see if we can come and work with them in Lesbos and include artists and designers, some of whom were based in Moria camp, some of who had recently arrived in Lesbos, and others who lived in Lesbos for a long time. So again, it was about creating intersections. And they wanted us to come work about counter cartographies. The ancient world, there are no maps to scale. So what does it mean to live in a world where there are no these kind of maps, or maybe other kinds of ways of thinking about connectivities and routeways as a way of connection and imagining place rather than a two-dimensional Euclidean plane? And when we got there, we thought we were going to be talking about thresholds. So Odysseus, who we talked about already, there's a lot that happens at the threshold. And we thought that would be interesting. So if we thought about ancient thresholds, how this continues, but actually what we found when we got there, this was around 2017 and 18, that the moment of the threshold had changed, because where in 2015, maybe we could have done something around threshold, that is not the concept that people felt they could engage with anymore. Things had moved on. So then we thought about neighboring. And I should say that in terms of pedagogy and radical pedagogy and walking as radical pedagogy, we did a lot of walking together and thinking together through the place. And we let people who we had come to visit, whether they were from Moria or not, to be our hosts, because some of them had lived there for a long time. So through these, we then suggested neighboring. And again, people came and said, we don't have neighbors here necessarily. Our neighbors are very far away. We will never have neighbors here. So that didn't seem to go anywhere. And then we all told different kind of stories. And one of the stories I told is about the idea that in Plautus, we don't really have a term for local. People are generally inhabitants of a place, but they inhabit the place in different ways. And this notion of inhabiting took hold. And so what we ended up creating a collective dictionary volume about, and having an exhibition about, writing poems about, writing dialogues, it was that around inhabiting. So my contribution to it was Plautus, but there were lots of other contributions to it as well, all of which you can probably find in the online inhabiting volume. So that was really fascinating. So that comes back to some of the questions you asked about, how do we engender a different kind of thinking, or at least get people to recognize there are many different ways of thinking about people in migration mobility, and not just the very linear ways that we seem to be constantly thinking about them today?
Yeah, so as you say, all sorts of different kinds of non-linear thinking and very imaginative, creative thinking. You used the phrase alternative imaginaries just now, and that reminds me of another project that you're involved in called Imagining Futures. As we've discussed, you've done very powerful work looking to antiquity to shed new light on modern understandings of mobility and migration. But your academic work is clearly something that you also see as a form of activism that looks firmly to the future. And the Imagining Futures project, as I understand it, asks very important questions about whose voices get to shape our collective future. So in lots of your work, you've looked closely at the kinds of voices we hear from, We've talked a little bit about the control of knowledge, the value of Indigenous knowledge, the importance of opening up storytelling spaces for people whose voices have often been marginalised. And the Imagining Futures project takes active steps to ensure a multiplicity and diversity of voices have their say through the preservation, the creation and the analysis of lots of different kinds of archives. So can you tell us a little bit about that, about the role that archiving for the future can play in how we visualise, understand and approach migration and migrants in future?
I was asking myself a lot is, where do displaced histories live? So to come back to the, if this is the non-exceptional, this is really part of society, well, people who are in displacement, where do they base their histories? It comes back to that notion we were talking about before, which is about making life meaningful wherever you might be, while not giving up the notion of return or notion of justice and protection and the right to have the protection, justice and belonging where you choose. So it partly comes back to that, but also it is about the idea that people who are often in displacement are often over-archived by others, quantified in numbers, in spaces, in status. They are fingerprinted. They are constantly having to tell certain stories that are recorded in certain kind of ways in legal documents. And the methods of doing this are often done through intermediaries, which, by the way, intermediaries also play a very interesting role in the ancient world, which we didn't talk about, we don't need to talk about, but the ability to tell a story in a way that it has an emotional meaning versus or a meaning as human to human. So we talked about reciprocity and interdependence as distinct one that you might put down on a piece of paper or then give in a court of law. And I actually have amazing colleagues I work with at Exeter. And together, we've brought together other people to think about a hub we call Roots, which works between research and also the community, but it's about migration, mobility and displacement, and it works anywhere from the humanities to the legal to the scientific, which I don't think we'll have time to talk about at the moment, but maybe they'll come in other ways. But they very much ask those kind of questions as well. So all that is to say that this is where I come into Imagining Futures. And I just to maybe address one point you said, which is about activism. I'm not sure I would call it activism, simply because, I guess the motto of which I used to have on my door for the students in particular was, it's about thinking together with somebody. And I guess that's what I would call it. It's not you do something for, it's you do something with someone. And I guess that doesn't mean that all activism is that. It really isn't. But in my case, I don't think I do enough of those kind of things to be able to claim to be an activist. It's very much dependent, almost always dependent on the generosity of others for me, or the generosity in creating spaces that we sometimes do together rather than me doing something for someone. So in a way, that's where I come to it. And what the project Imagining Futures through Unarchived Past tries to do is, first of all, expand the meaning of the notion of archive, recognize that certain people don't have a choice and are archived by others, but don't necessarily their own forms of archiving, which might be oral histories, which might be dance, which might be recognizing a certain site as a sacred place, are all forms of archive. And those are often not the ones that are recognized for purposes of preservation in our frameworks. So even something like UNESCO, which of course in many contexts is highly, highly controversial, that tries to preserve certain kind of heritages, often heritages that are recognized internationally, heritages that might be known about internationally, and often tangible. They also have preservation of oral histories and now whole landscapes, so they are expanding that. But sometimes it's very small things that are not preserved. So in a post-conflict scenario, what you might get is a reconstruction, and sometimes the reconstruction that happens, well-meaning as it might be by humanitarian actors, doesn't necessarily take into account something that might not be seen as old or architecturally interesting, but might have been a common place where lots of people met, and something that has a lot of meaning, like a street that sells books, where readings may have happened, where authors were invited, and where people of all kinds of factions, sectors, religions might have met in a safe space. But because it's not necessarily a mosque or a church or a synagogue, it may not be deemed worthy of preservation, and maybe a master plan would erase it. So one of the things that we try to do in the project is especially to recognize egalitarian forms of archiving that would allow supranational, other kind of organizations to recognize these other forms of being together, of placemaking that may not be seen through maybe even the governments of these kind of places. That's one thing. The other thing we address is very much reading existing archives against the grain to, as you mentioned, bring those other voices in, and that could be historic archives, recently made archives. So to listen to those other voices, or sometimes to listen to gesture. So if you have the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, even in a place like South Africa, post-apartheid, I mean, how do you listen to the cries that may or may not be recorded in that court archive? What do those mean? What other story do they tell beyond the words and the facts? We might also deal with, as I mentioned, unfinished histories, which means that legacies of colonial pasts or other kinds of pasts, erasure and overwriting. So how do we bring some of those back? And of course, displaced people in displacement are about continuous intergenerational trauma as well, not just for people in displacement. How are those recognized? But how are those also used, not just simply for the sake of archiving or the sake of recording digitally or otherwise, but how do those allow either those histories to be finished or recognize connectivities, not just ruptures between different communities? And an example I can bring is the Yarmouk camp. And one thing about Yarmouk camp is it is a refugee camp that has existed for a long time in Syria, which is a kind of a testament to people who were displaced living together with people in Syria. And during the war, it was destroyed and a master plan was brought in to which kind of erases it completely, which didn't care about the lives of people there because they were displaced, they're meaningless. And even if they get new houses, it didn't matter that they did manage to create meaningful lives and places were made meaningful. And Edouard Hanna and his colleagues, Noor, have organized something called Surbanism, which is based in Vienna, but it was created to allow architects in the diaspora from Syria and architects inside Syria to have a voice in what happens to places inside Syria at the time. So what they did was they created a kind of a graphic novel type story about these lives lived together, just to recognize it, to highlight its existence, and to also challenge some of these very sweeping and in some cases gentrifying situations. So that's just one example, but there are many, many others. There are recordings of graffiti art in Iraq, which was a kind of a revolution or rebellion, and interviewing some of these artists, sometimes who are actually risking their lives putting up these artworks, but also noting the symbols that are being used by some of these young people, which is not about the current sectarian things, but going back to ancient symbols and ancient monuments to represent a different kind of future and a different kind of narrative of the stories. So, and we could turn to the poetry of Yusuf Kazmieh, who writes about the camp archive and what that means, and thinks about these things a lot from the perspective of people who live in the camp and from those voices there. I mean, there are many, many more things. There's over 50 projects at the moment and over 200 people who are part of Imagining Futures, who are all thinking into how we put together metaphorically a manifesto of egalitarian archival practices.
Wow, that's an amazing project. And I really like the question you posed, where do displaced histories live in a project like this? Obviously is the answer. And also the very important point you made that migrants, among other marginalized groups, are over-archived by other people. And that's, again, comes back to this question about knowledge production, about controlling the production of knowledge around different groups of people, making them known in certain ways, but controlling their voices and controlling what remains unknown about them too. So the Imagining Futures project is a very important counterbalance to all of that. Elena, you do so much work of such a variety that it's very, very difficult to talk about all of it. But I wonder if we could just think a little bit about the future for you and where your research is likely to take you next. Do you think you will continue working on aspects of migration, displacement, and belonging for the next decade or so?
Yeah, well, I think it's now become kind of part of most things that I do, whatever the subject happens to be. I think there are several things I want to explore. I really want to understand much more how we value other kind of knowledges and how we bring in those to think with. I think it would make for such a much richer, not just in academia, but also bridging that often gap between academia and other parts of communities, and recognizing that community, whether displaced or not, is actually not singular. It's not homogeneous. It's a multiplicity of people which come with their own issues and problems, but also talents and imaginings. One of the things I want to develop much more, just coming back from thinking together with colleagues in Berlin at Potsdam University about setting up a migration studies program, we actually realized that this was the wrong thing to do because, again, it exceptionalizes migration. So we shouldn't do a program just about people moving, but understand, rather, make explicit the different kinds of mobilities, both in our classes and outside them. And one of the things we got a chance to do, partly thanks to the time given by our colleagues in Kakuma refugee camp, and particularly another historian who happens to live there, is Gerward Tefera. And we created student-to-student dialogues where one of the things we did is think about big concepts in history, and students in Potsdam University worked together with students in Kakuma refugee camp, and they created projects together. And they were anything from thinking about youth democracy to thinking about climate change. And what came out was just how much of an opening of different ways of understanding the world just that kind of relationship brought about, and what they managed to create through their projects, which was partly done through global history. And my hosts there in Potsdam, Marcia Schenk and Filippo Carla Uhink, is just how much we need to celebrate that kind of knowledge creation, how quickly it can happen, and how quickly one can find out about the different ways of being in the world, and how that can help one going forward. And then what do we do about that? So that to me is highly important. But the other, I guess, in terms of my own more specific academic research, which will connect to some of this, it's really thinking about value of a body out of place is some of the things I'm thinking about a lot at the moment, because I found that actually hospitality is not a stable enough concept across time. It means different things. It sometimes means negative things. It's legalized or not legalized. But thinking about how people who are out of place of protection, belonging, and rights, and I mean body. The reason I mean body is because I'm interested in the spatiality of that. So how are people put into spaces or not allowed into spaces, and how that not being able to connect to certain physicalities actually puts them out of place, and then how they themselves are able to have agency and find value, but also how others take advantage of that or require that to then push through their own ambitions, goals, and policies. So it's how people are different in displacement, whether it's people who are in the carceral system today, people who might be hostages, people who might be prisoners of war, to people who are seeking asylum because of war and other situations in their own countries. But importantly, think together with people, including somebody like you who does amazing work. And just even listening to your questions has made me realize a lot and learn a lot as well. So thank you very much, Alice, for that.
Thank you, Lena. As you say, listening to different kinds of knowledge and thinking with different kinds of people is incredibly important. And, as well as exploding assumptions about migration, we might explode assumptions about expertise in the process. But that body out of space work that you've got lined up as well is another way of visualizing displacement. And that brings me to my last question, if I may. As you know, our Visualizing Forced Migration project is not only interested in exploring past and present habits of imagining, understanding, and representing forced displacement, but also in stretching those habits and in deepening understanding for the future. So what, if anything, would you like to see changed in how we view migrants and migration and mobility going forward? And how do you think our project can help with that?
Well, I mean, I think your project is already helping with that by actually posing these kind of questions and just being, I think also putting a critical approach to them. So one of the things by looking at your project is what really makes one recognize is that what we need to listen to is definitely people who are in the context that sometimes are the subject or the object of our research, and recognize that they aren't that, but that we need to really research together and co-author. That's something I really want to see happening a lot more of, or co-speak, to be co-listened to, so not speaking on behalf of, but speaking together with. Also recognizing that those people who may not want to see migration mobility in very particular ways, that we're not just working in an echo chamber, but really listen to those people and try to understand what is it that they feel threatened by? Why are they feel like they struggle to be understood? So it comes from both sides. And I think I definitely haven't done enough of that. And in many ways, your project is something that will hopefully, I learn a lot from it to go into that direction, because sometimes those people are just like, well, there's no point in engaging, they'll never change their mind. But it's not about changing minds, but rather, again, thinking together and to try to understand what it is that this feeling right, and also root causes. So one of the things about migration mobility, I guess the one takes away today, is that we see those as the cause of the problems. That's the thing we have to deal with. But actually, as you started with, Alice, is your observation that it's a symptom for forced mobility anyways. So the question then is, well, what are the root causes? Where do we need to look to understand that? And also shift our attention away from the people who are running away from this, sometimes very difficult context, and understand cui bono is something Cicero said, who is actually benefiting? Who is benefiting from selling all these arms? Who is benefiting from people escaping? Why are societies and countries not more interested in finding ways of keeping or creating a safe context for the people to stay? Why is there no interest in that? And I think by shifting those questions, we can stop exceptionalizing people on the move and almost like get rid of the concept of migration as an object of study in some ways, that realize it's part of society and is maybe other things that are causal factors, not least climate change, as you mentioned. So how do we stop relocation and sometimes necessary relocation from becoming displacement? Well, we can only understand that by listening to the people who are being displaced, and often people who are indigenous and work on grounds that their livelihood depends on, that is being completely destroyed, about and by people from the Shishmaref community and other native peoples who particularly work in the Arctic and western coast of the United States and Canada. One of the things they said is we need to realize that for us, permafrost and sea ice is infrastructure. That is our livelihood, and we need it to survive. So it's not just a matter of climate change. It is actually part of our society and our landscape.
Yeah. Thank you, Elena. There's so much to take away from this conversation for me. But that vision that you've got of the future where migration might no longer be a subject of study because we've stopped exceptionalizing it is a huge takeaway from me. That's a wonderful ambition. And you've laid out some of the steps that would get us there. So it is about listening. It's about listening not only to the voices of forced migrants, but to the voices of people who see them as threats. Absolutely. Understanding that, and then understanding, and you've shown us in lots of ways how antiquity can help with this, understanding some of these root causes of forced migration, but also the root causes, as you say, that prevent a state or a community from being willing to offer asylum, or the causes that make that acceptable, that make that a good, a viable, a recognizably moral thing to do. The ancient world has a lot to teach us, as do many other modern contexts.
The one thing I would say about the ancient world is, for me, many times it is a starting point for what I do, but that is not at all to say it was a better or worse place. There were equal violences and other ways of exclusion, even if it wasn't necessarily about what we today call the migrant. So that it's not about a trajectory of somehow, it was better then, but rather that it was different then.
Elena, I completely agree with that analysis of the ancient world. We've for far too long put the ancient world on a pedestal, but thinking with the ancient world as a window onto ours can be very useful and illuminating, and without us having to look back at it as some kind of superior model. I'm hugely grateful to you for taking the time to talk to me in such depth today. Your work has been so inspiring, not just me, but also my students, who are also very, very interested in radical pedagogies and thinking together with and working as allies with people outside the academy, not just fellow scholars. So they and I will take a lot from this conversation.
I know I've said how much I've not just enjoyed this, but also how incredibly important it is for my own work now. And just to thank you again and your students and all your colleagues for this incredible project.
Thank you. And thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Professor Elena Isayev as much as I did. Do keep tuning into our podcast. As I said at the start, we've got a series of episodes coming out exploring different aspects of how we visualize forced migration as part of our wider work on war and its aftermath. If you've got any questions about our work, please do get in touch. You can follow us on social media, just search for Visualising War, or contact us directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. If you would like to support our project, please share and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. And please do leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts because it really helps people find the show. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you very much for listening.